As the British continued to need more and more money to help pay off their war debts, they continued to pass various taxes that the colonists were required to pay. We've already looked at some like the Navigation Acts. We've already looked at the Sugar Act, the Molasses Act. The Stamp Act is going to be a little different. This one is going to place a direct tax on the colonist. This one means that the colonists saw this one every time that they went to purchase one of these items that this tax was on. It's going to require a stamp on all legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards that you would play with, like playing card games. So this one is going to be very visible. And it's, again, direct, meaning it comes directly. It is taxed on the colonist directly as opposed to at the merchants and traders. So this one is one that colonists see every time they use one of these products. So it's things like marriage licenses, things like death certificates, every time they buy a newspaper. And remember, people at this point in time are going to read newspapers the way you guys check your social media feeds. So it's going to be something that's very visible, something they see all the time. This is also a tax that is going to affect colonists across the board. This is not only affecting the rich, like your merchants and traders, this one affects the poor as well. So the colonists are going to be extremely unhappy over the Stamp Act. The Quartering Act is another one that colonists are going to be very angry about. This one is going to require colonists to pay money to help take care of soldiers. You even see them begin to require them to be allowed to live on their property and in their homes. In some cases, they would live in their, if they had a warehouse, they might live there, or a barn, or even in their home itself. So even if they're not in their home, they're still having to pay a tax to help take care of them. Again, the British saw this as legitimate because those soldiers were there protecting them. The colonists resented this very much. The Sons of Liberty is going to be based in Boston, Massachusetts. This is probably the city that was the most outspoken against all British policies. And some of its leaders were Samuel Adams and John Adams, along with Patrick Henry. He's the one who has the whole slogan, "Give me liberty or give me death," in his very famous fiery speech that he gives when talking about separating from the British. So this organization is going to organize a lot of protests that happen in the city. So they are kind of rabble rousers, right? They're going to try to get people all fired up about whatever the issue is. In this case, it's taxes. No taxation without representation. They're going to organize protests. They organize boycotts of certain companies or goods to try to get their point across. They're also going to be responsible for harassing stamp agents. And when I say harassing, I mean things like tarring and feathering them, covering them with tar and then covering them, dumping feathers on them after that. This was not only a humiliation, but could also be a costly on their physical health as well. So really are going to do their best to protest against all of these taxes. Now, they were eventually successful at getting the Stamp Act repealed. This is going to be seen as a victory for them, but the colonists are not satisfied. They don't like any of these taxes. So the Townshend Act is going to be a new tax, and this one's going to be on things like tea, glass, paper, and paint. And again, colonists don't like it, so they're going to again organize protests and various boycotts on those items. And the British are going to react by sending more troops into the area. Again, they are trying to, at this point, salutary neglect is gone. They need the money. So they're going to send more troops to try to restore order and to maintain their control over these colonies. The Boston Massacre. When you hear the word massacre, you think of large numbers of people being killed. When you hear Boston Massacre, you also think of this painting that you see here, or this engraving on the left. This happens in March of 1770, and it starts by a protest that was led by the colonists. There are lots of different accounts about what happened, but in the end, British troops fired on the crowd, killing 5 people. So the Redcoats, you see them here as what they were nicknamed, fire on that crowd, killing 5 colonists, including Crispus Attucks, who you will talk about a little later. those soldiers were put on trial for murder, and most of them were found not guilty. They even have John Adams served as the attorney for the soldiers, the man who was really a patriot, but he believed that these men deserved a fair defense against these charges. So we'll look more closely at the Boston Massacre, but what you can tell already from this picture is that this was used to again rile up the colonists for the patriot cause, to talk about how brutal these British were on the colonists. The tax on tea is going to remain in effect, and the way this tax was designed, it was designed so that it could give a monopoly to a company called the British East India Tea Company, so that this particular company would basically not go bankrupt. So the colonists didn't like this, even though this whole tax actually made the tea cheaper than what they could smuggle it in for. At this point, the colonists were angry for the principle of the issue. So when this happens, they are going to protest again, and this is again on those Townshend Acts. So in December of 1773, a group of colonists, probably the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawk Indians. This is what you see here in this picture right here. They dressed up as Mohawk Indians, then raided the harbor and threw tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, which was a lot of money, and then burned the ship, so caused a lot of damage. The British had to react to this, and they did by passing what were called the Intolerable Acts. They were actually called the Coercive Acts in Great Britain, but the colonists are going to call them the Intolerable Acts. So you need to know them as both names. The Coercive Acts and Intolerable Acts are the same thing. This is going to close Boston Harbor until all of that tea was paid for. Now remember, closing Boston Harbor is really going to directly impact these colonists, because it's a port city. That's where their money comes from. That's how they make money, was through all of the trade that comes in and out of that port. So they closed that port until it was paid for. They're going to suspend their basic civil rights and then flood the city with more troops. They're even going to house them in people's homes. So the resentment in the colonies are going to be growing by the day after the passage of the Intolerable Acts. You begin to see the development of what are called committees of correspondence. And what you need to understand was this was just a way for the various colonies to communicate with one another, to know where each colony stood on what was going on in the colonies, what was going on in different colonies, and kind of plans of action. So all the committees of correspondence did was just set up deliberate communication between the colonies so they could all be on the same page when it came to what was happening with the British and all of these taxes. So we're starting to see in the colonies the move toward a more unified response, or at least attempting to come to a more unified response with these committees of correspondence.